Well, I have to say, I do feel in a bit of a minority group tonight. All my thoroughly distinguished female colleagues, of whom I am extremely proud, I have to say. The subject of my talk tonight is around the vexed issue and continuing issue of Indigenous people in Western Australia and the criminal justice system. I've been involved in this issue for the last 25 years. When I arrived in Australia in 1991, at the same time as the Royal Commission into Aboriginal Deaths in Custody, 1991 was bringing down its recommendations. And I arrived here in Perth to take up a job at state government on a committee that was looking about how to implement the recommendations, and I was kind of headhunted as because I'd worked in England around, particularly around youth justice and juvenile justice and policing and these other things, and I got invited initially in a secondment to come here, and I recall arriving here in about September, October 1991 and staying in Catherine College at UWA, hosted by my dear friend and colleague, Professor Richard Harding at the law school here, and walking around Netherlands on a Saturday and Sunday looking for Aboriginal people. Yes, funny, isn't it? Yeah. And then a Monday morning, going to my orientation week with the courts, Department of Corrections, and walking in the Children's Court. Then in East Perth, or building in East Perth, some of you may remember. I'm thinking, Christ, that's actually the moderate version of what I thought. Now I know I couldn't find any. They're all in here. And after that, going to the youth detention system, the Casuarina prison, the Bandia women's prison, and wondering where the hell I'd come to. And very quickly I concluded that whatever this is about isn't really about law and order as I'd learned about it in my university career in the UK and the United States. And working over the next couple of years, I began to recognise a massive disconnect between what I was teaching in the academy here and other places and what I was experiencing in the field, talking to Aboriginal people, going into jails and going around Aboriginal communities in Western Australia, and realising that this wagon train of ideas and theories and so on I'd acquired in my career as a criminologist had to be radically rethought to take account of the fact that, to put it in not too kind of crude a way, our criminal justice system has been used as an instrument of dispossession, as part of a colonising process which has undermined, quite deliberately undermined Aboriginal society, Aboriginal family life, and Aboriginal forms of law to impose and to legitimate our occupation of this continent. That might seem heavy stuff when we're all sitting around having tapas and a nice drink, but that's the world I work in. And I find it increasingly difficult to sugar that particular pill. You know, when we're constantly, kind of rise again in deaths in custody. Some of you might have watched the Four Corners programme last night. Recent death of Miss Du in a dying in a prison cell in Port Hedland in the most disgusting and dire circumstances. and it's a serious issue. I've called this "It's Not Broken." It is broken, so why can't we fix it? Because we all do accept now it's broken. Numerous inquiries you read, I pick up on a daily basis saying that it's all wrong, we've got it all wrong. And yet why is it that we can't change the way we do things in relation to criminal justice? And that's because fundamentally we can't change our relationship with the indigenous population, and one is reliant very much on the other. Well, I'm a researcher, and as Linda Tuawi-Smith, the magnificent Māori scholar, would say, research is one of the dirtiest words in the indigenous vocabulary globally. So my name's Harry and I'm a researcher, and that's not always a good way to establish a good relationship with an indigenous audience, is if you are going around doing the kind of work that I do. Why is that? Research seems to just like a neutral process where we assemble facts and we construct theories and come up with solutions. But what I've learned, I think, very much over the last 25 years, is that they're all assembled and based upon a Western epistemology, a Western view of the world, and a Western history in which we are the heroes, settlers. We've created this place called Australia. And from an indigenous perspective, that's entirely, the wrong way around. And our research, I've learned over the years, is actually a very powerful tool for legitimising our monopoly of knowledge. So what I've tried to do over the last 25 years of my work, or the last 20 years of my work, is to invert that relationship. And instead of starting from the top, beginning from the bottom. This isn't a statistical presentation. In fact, I took a lot of the stats out a few hours ago, you'd be very pleased to know. This is just one that I kind of picked up because it's fairly graphic. And the left-hand column there is the kind of rate of overrepresentation of Indigenous youth in the justice system across Australia. The middle one is our own state, Western Australia, and we're known as the kind of a deep south of the correctional landscape of Australia. We're the Alabama, those where we sit around and get very smug and patronising about those things about United States, but we are. In fact, and I'm not sure, it has been fact-checked, this is by Institute of Health and Welfare, but it's estimated, the figures may be not totally sound, but I think it gives a fairly good picture, because that extreme right side is the overrepresentation of black youth in the United States. And people I talk to are saying, well, the rates of overrepresentation now, particularly of Aboriginal youth and Aboriginal women in our justice system, are higher than comparative rates in apartheid South Africa. So we can be very proud of, our history on this. So some of the work I did for Amnesty International a couple of years ago now, we produced a report keeping Indigenous kids in the community and out of detention. We know that the national overrepresentation rate of Indigenous kids is about 26 times. So they're 26 times more likely to be arrested by the police and placed in detention. Well, it's much higher in Western Australia, 53 times higher. And the only state comparable to ours is the Northern Territory. That's it, the place we laugh at for being a redneck. Actually does better on some indices than we do, particularly about the number of kids in the out-of-home care. The rate of overrepresentation in juvenile detention is about the same as the rate of a representation of out-of-home care. So the kind of and so, you know, then this is the problem with my top subject, which is Western criminology, because we all say, well, why is that now? But we should be looking historically, because these are the direct results of a very successful strategy of undermining Aboriginal family life and destroying their culture. So, congratulations, we've been very successful in doing that, and these are the consequences of it. I'm not doing this to make us all feel bad. I just think that we need occasionally to have a little bit of, get slapped on the belly by a wet cod or something, just to, you know, kind of wake us up a little bit. So on any one day anyway, in detention in Western Australia, about 78 to 80% of the kids in there are Indigenous. They're about 4% of the youth population of the state. So that makes me, as a criminologist, wary about ascribing this to higher rates of criminal behaviour. Or if it does do that, then looking in a different way about what that criminal behaviour tells us. So we're currently undertaking 3 interrelated projects in Western Australia, which are linked to this issue. With my colleague Tamara Tolic, I'd like to say in the audience this evening, we're doing a research project on fetal alcohol spectrum disorders in 3 communities in the West Kimberley, looking at diversionary alternatives for kids who are considered to be FASD. Fetal alcohol spectrum disorders are an umbrella term that relates to a whole range of complications following maternal use of alcohol around the time of inception and after. And our research, our reading of the research, I should say, lends us to view that some of the communities that we're looking at, upwards of 1 in 5, 1 in 6 of the children in these communities will have FASD. And that's as high as any rate internationally. Why is that important? Well, it means that kids with FASD can't imagine a future. They have difficulty in reasoning and forming logical connections, and therefore they're they're discriminated against in contact with the criminal justice system. And our system is based on the premise that people are reasoned actors, deterred by the threat of punishment or rewards. If you have FASD or a cognitive disability, that doesn't apply. And yet we still apply these same tests to kids, assuming that they're rational, reasonable adults. And the other problem in Western Australia is we have this insane piece of legislation called the Mentally Impaired Accused Act, which means that if you're found to be unfit to plea, you could be locked up indefinitely in detention. And that's happened, we know, increasingly to Aboriginal kids. So, you know, we have a real problem with that issue. And what we're looking at there, I'll come up to that in a minute, but basically how can we get these kids out of the system altogether? How can we build in diversionary pathways which take young people out of that punitive system and into alternative forms of care and control? And we think those are the things that should be provided by the Aboriginal community, because every time we try and do things like that, we stuff it up. Right, so that's one. The second one that we're engaging in, again in the Kimberley region, but also in Northern Territory and Queensland, is looking at responses to Indigenous women and family violence. And again, that's a really topical issue, and there's constantly stuff in the media about the massively high rates of victimisation. We know that Aboriginal women are about 55 times more likely to be the victim of a domestic violence episode than a non-Aboriginal woman. So it's a serious problem. So we're looking at solutions in that area. And finally, and it's one that people don't always think to me, well, why are you doing that? You know, but I find it just fascinating. We tend to have we seem to have assimilated in Australia such a view of Aboriginal people as dysfunctional and incapable of formulating their own solutions, that we are blind to the very real things that they do in their own communities. And one of these things are night patrols. If you go down Northbridge, like that, there's a Noongar patrol, and there are patrols across Australia where Indigenous people, as volunteers, often work half the night to pick people up who are intoxicated, prevent family violence incidents from developing, and so on. And I find this is a powerful counter to this narrative that we've assembled about Indigenous incapacity and dysfunction. So, one of the things that we're looking at, and one of the things that connects these projects, is the role, particularly of Aboriginal women, in forming the solution. And the solution is a paper that was given at the conference I went to earlier this year by the wonderful June Oscar from Fitzroy Crossing, who's the wonderful Bunaba leader in the Fitzroy area. And she said Aboriginal women are part of the solution. They're not just these docile, passive victims of Aboriginal male violence, which is a total distortion, I believe. And they are part of a movement which is slowly gaining ground, which is about providing an alternative set of sites for looking after kids in particular. So on my picture here, that lovely Indigenous painting in the middle is from Marning One into Kurna Women's Resource Centre in Fitzroy Crossing. We find that Aboriginal women are active in things like women's night patrols, and about over half of workers on these night patrols across Australia are women, and over half the clients they look after are women as well. So they're a very active part of the solution. In the middle there's the lovely picture of June Oscar and a colleague developing of family violence services in places like Fitzroy Crossing, which are based upon the principles that it is Aboriginal with people who have the solutions to problems about family violence and so on. And finally, on the far left side there, Nindalingari Cultural Health Services in Fitzroy Crossing, who have developed their own models of intervention around FASD with kids. One of the things that unites these various new kinds of strategy are a focus on Aboriginal country as the focal point for a new solution to these problems. In places like the Kimberley now, over 80% of the landmass is now subject to a native title claim solution. So we're living in a post native title era where Aboriginal people are developing up their own industries around country and want to increasingly use country as a central point for not just for economic development, but for healing and as a way of regenerating culture. We've become very interested in that in our work, and we are supporting processes which allow courts, the police, community organisations to divert young people into what we're calling un-country programmes. We think this is quite radical and revolutionary because it takes the focus away from what white institutions do to what Indigenous organisations, Indigenous families, Indigenous people are capable of achieving. So one of the ones that we're particularly fond of and relate to a lot in our work is one like the Irriman project in Fitzroy Crossing, and that's run by an organisation called CALAC, which stands for Kimberley Aboriginal Law and Culture, and that's sort of like a clearinghouse for all of the senior law bosses in the Kimberley. And they got together some years ago and said that we need to develop alternative strategies for our kids in the context of these massive rates of suicide, significantly high levels of involvement in the criminal justice system, problems like FASD, which can't be cured, right? So we've got to find places where we can manage these kids in a relatively normal context. And we believe in our work that country provides that paradigm area. Finish. Yeah, I'm finishing now. So I think it's the last slide. So I have finished virtually. I just wanted to say, so we in our work here at UWA are moving away from this model where we think we can just simply reform the youth justice system or the women's justice system and have to decolonise these processes, resource and add value to processes embedded in Aboriginal law and culture and based upon this reclamation of country. So, there you go. Thank you.